1988, John Barnes won the first of his two Footballer of the Year awards, but John was just as important for his cultural impact. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly, John Barnes was a magnificent player at that time, at his peak in that Liverpool team, with Peter playing alongside Peter Beardsley, under Kenny Dalglish. Some of the greatest team performances I've ever seen, and John Barnes was at the heart of everything. He made a cultural breakthrough in terms of he was the highest profile black player of his time, certainly in that Liverpool team, certainly in the England team, and he grew to personify a modern player that wasn't going to conform to a stereotype. It wasn't going to be, submissive, as footballers were. He was outspoken. He was articulate. He was never afraid of tackling a cultural issue to do with racism. And obviously, everybody knows that famous picture of him with the banana and him back heeling that away. I think that was really the beginning of the growth of confidence that black players had. I think that he defined the modern black player. And I think that, and I know that he's still a very important spokesman for the black community. Not everybody agrees with him, certainly in the black community. But he has been at the forefront of determining that to tackle racism, you have to educate people. And it was the same back then. He was articulate enough to be able to explain himself fantastically well. He stood for something. He stood for the modern black player who wasn't just flitting in and out of a team. That the team was built around, and that was hugely important at that time, I think.
He was a double Footballer of the Year, but he was just the fifth man at the time to do so. Just how good was he to have got two awards when the only other players by that stage were Sir Stanley Matthews, Sir Tom Finney, Danny Blanchflower, so Kenny Dalglish, so real greats of the game. How good was John?
He was an amazing player. He was absolutely, we saw later in his career, he dropped back and played in midfield. He had that vision, he had that awareness, he had that passing ability. But to see John Barnes in his pomp was to see a player who just simply didn't think that there was anybody better than him in the game at the time. He just oozed that kind of confidence, and it wasn't arrogance at all. There was no way you could throw that at him. But he knew what he could do, and he did it time and time again. And that Liverpool team of the late 80s, mid to late 80s, was phenomenal. I loved watching them. I'm not a Liverpool fan by any stretch of the imagination, but I loved watching them. The understanding that he had, and you couldn't define what position he played. Yes, he probably started him wide, but so many times he would drift inside, and it was a little bit like Thierry Henry when he was at Arsenal. He would start out wide, and he was a centre forward, but he would start out wide and come in, and he read the game fantastically well, John Barnes. He absolutely knew where the ball was going to be, what he could do with it. His passing range, everybody talks about him as a winger and his ability to beat a man, but his passing range was phenomenal. His vision was up there with the very best midfielders, if you like. And he was strong. You couldn't push him off the ball. You couldn't intimidate him. I thought he was an absolutely fantastic player.
I mean, it was great fun to do because John's such brilliant company, and it was more than a football book. I mean, it's interesting. People said, obviously, it's a football book. He talked about his footballing development and Watford, Liverpool, his remarkable performances at Liverpool, and his some of his better performances for England. But he also talked about racism, the racism that he endured. I mean, we're similar ages, and we grew up in similar parts of London. And there would be shops where I would go as a kid and get all my sports kit, Lily Whites, on Piccadilly Circus. I'm sure you know. And he said, well, he was standing outside there one day in his Watford tracksuit, and the doorman at Lily Whites moved him on because he was black. And he talked about the racist abuse that he endured. Obviously, it happened at Everton. The incidents with the the bananas thrown on the pitch, the famous picture of him flicking the banana off the pitch. And he talked, as he does now, talks very eloquently. And for me, of all, I mean, I've been lucky to do a few books, but it was such an education just listening to John and what he went through. And obviously a lot of people took on the book as a book about racism, but it was also a book about class, because John comes from a very middle class family in Jamaica. His father was a very distinguished military man, who then became an attaché in London, and his mother was effectively the Sue Lawley of Jamaican broadcasting, very well-known broadcaster. So John grew up in a beautiful house with probably 6 or 7 people working in the garden, let alone in the house. So I think that was one of the reasons why he responded. You know, when he got abused, he would just sort of raise his eyebrows and he wouldn't fight back. But I absolutely found it just fascinating. And I reread the book the other day, and so much of what John said rings true. So yeah, it was absolute education. So John, again, is one of those footballers whose influence extends so far beyond the pitch. I mean, he's influenced English football, but he's also influenced English society with a lot of his views and his eloquence, and his what I would call a very mature cerebral fight against racism, as someone who would actually have every reason to turn around and absolutely slaughter a crowd. John just rose above that. Very handsome man, very, very charismatic. I mean, one of my favorite memories was he was up on the Wirral, at his house on the Wirral, Heswell, I think it was. And we're working, he said, would you want to stay the night? And he had a spare room upstairs, but it was a spare room where he kept all his old suits. So they were all hanging on. So I was sort of lying on this bed against the wall, but there were these hangers, like sort of tailors, hanging sort of things that they have. And he, all his suits were on there. And it was like walking along sort of Blackpool beach with all the sort of illuminations, all the suits. And you just remember, this is a man, and another individual who's really enjoyed life, you know, the Anfield Rat. I mean, he was just all those sort of things, you know, world in motion. I mean, he's just he's a sort of legend of sort of English society as well as English football. But as a footballer, I mean, I always think the best footballers don't leave footprints, and John Barnes wouldn't have left footprints on the snow. I mean, he just had that, you know, the goal against QPR, you know, when he just sort of he just drove through his skill, drop of the shoulder. Just amazing skill. And the resilience, you know, he got absolutely battered in one newspaper. Well, he got battered in a few newspaper articles about why he didn't deliver for England, and then he got booed against San Marino, and then he scored that free kick. And, you know, I don't think John Barnes is properly appreciated in this country in terms of what an absolutely sensational footballer that he was. I almost wished, obviously he went to Liverpool and he did amazing things with Liverpool, but they had the European ban. I almost wished at one point he'd gone to Real Madrid and actually had 3 years in his pomp, playing at Real Madrid, being seen in the European Cup, being seen as one of the greatest players in the world, because he had everything. I mean, he had pace. Obviously, that was slightly affected by the Achilles against Finland, but I think he had the pace, he had the athleticism, he had the intelligence. He could go both ways. Go outside a fullback, cut inside. He could actually play at centre forward if he wanted to, because he's got that strength. He's a remarkable footballer. And okay, so he's won it twice, and fair play to the sort of journalists for appreciating that. But what a footballer! I just think when people are looking back of our all-time greats, I would have John Barnes in the top 20 of English all-time greats, because he was just formidable. Just a phenomenal player. When people talk about the England great players now, when people are making comparisons, they don't often mention John Barnes enough. Maybe because wingers are maybe slightly going out of fashion, his style of winger, but God, he could do everything.